allowing my kids to have their own separate phone line. It was a few days after Christmas, and my parents had gotten me my own personal phone with my own separate phone line because that was the cool thing to do back then. And I had given my friends my number because who wouldn't, right? Anyways, it's about 3 a.m. and I've been sleeping when my phone begins to ring. I thought, that's odd, who could be calling me at this early? We all have to be up for school in the morning. So I answer it, but all I hear was breathing on the other end. I laughed it off as someone just messing with me and hung up. I tried returning to my sleep, but my phone rang again. This time I answered it and said, "Who is this?" Nothing, just breathing again. At this point I began to get irritated. I told them to stop calling me and hang up. I lay down again for about 30 minutes when my phone rang for yet a third time that morning. I was mad, so I answered it and said, "This isn't funny, I'm trying to sleep. I have school in the morning, stop calling me." This time there was a reply. It was a man's voice, sounded very gravelly, and he laughed and said, "I can see you. You're very pretty. Why don't you come and play in the snow with me?" With that, I hung up and started crying. I ran to my parents' room and woke up my mom, telling her what had happened. She then proceeded to wake up my dad. So they both get up and my dad goes into my room and checks the windows and everything, makes sure the locks on the doors are locked, and proceeds to tell me that it's someone just playing a sick joke, and that everything is fine, and tells me to just unplug my phone from the outlet. So finally I go back to sleep until the next morning when my mom wakes me up for school. I get up and start getting ready. I open my blinds to the windows that lead to our backyard, and notice on this very frosty morning that there are handprints all over my window. I called my parents and they're totally freaked out. My dad immediately calls the police. The police come out and take a report, and they decide they want to go to the backyard. Sure enough, there were footprints in the snow that led right up to my window. The police thinks the guy tried to get inside the house. I used to be a trucker, and would do a lot of late night runs. I usually had my coffee to keep me going through the night, and even then it would still be tough. This night, however, I didn't have my coffee, and things weren't going so well. On several occasions, I almost fell asleep behind the wheel, and I was only just barely able to save myself from completely drifting away by actually feeling the truck drift off to the side of the road. Just when I thought I was regaining my awareness, I saw a black figure coming up in the road, right in the path of the truck. I swerved away to avoid it, and just barely missed it. I came to a complete stop to try to gather up my sanity. I look in my rearview mirror. The figure was still standing in the middle of the road. I am not usually the person to confront things in any situation, but something possessed me to get out of my truck to give this person a piece of my mind. But when I got out of the truck, there was nobody there. I was seemingly the only person on this road for miles. I took off after that, and about 5 miles down the road I pulled over and slept for the night. I think my mind was playing tricks on me that night, but I don't know why my brain would create such an eerie image. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the US. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who decidedly was not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend the time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite. But all that would change a few minutes of one evening. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, for a weeknight, with little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back down to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street was the silhouette of a man dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say that he was dance walking, heading straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how graceful he was moving. He was very tall and lanky and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could see his face. His eyes were open wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painful wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, I decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on him. He didn't move. Once I had put about a half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments, I felt relieved, until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I looked away from him for more than 10 seconds, so it was clear he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time, staring at him, and then he started moving towards me. He took giant exaggerated tiptoe steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone. Except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point that I ran away or pulled out my pepper spray or my cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there completely frozen as the smiling man crept towards me. And then he stopped, about a car length away from me, still smiling, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to my mind. What I meant to say was, "What the fuck do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. But what came out was a whimper. What the fuck? Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they certainly can hear it. I heard it in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around very slowly and started dance-walking away, just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go, until he was far enough to almost be out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way. And this time, he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side road and back onto a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I was expecting to see a stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went on another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk, he didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane, and that's a very, very scary thing to see. In the earliest months of 2014, I started dating my current boyfriend. We hit it off immediately, which resulted in me staying at his house multiple nights out of the week. Eventually, I ended up living there, sharing a mobile home with him and his father. The neighborhood itself was fairly creepy, one of those unnamed country areas that branched from a main road. Richard, my boyfriend's dad, would tell me stories about how the entire street was owned by one man, a guy who had gotten old in recent years and let the land go. As a result, a field beside the mobile home was overgrown with weeds and old trees. He also told me about strange occurrences which he attributed to two things: aliens and kids from another neighborhood. Despite his warnings and how creepy the area was, I didn't take him too seriously. After all, his biggest concern was aliens. I was unemployed for a short period of time after moving in, which left me alone in the house while Cody, my boyfriend, and his dad went to work. I spent most of my days putting in job applications, cleaning up the house, and reading online. I guess you could say that my presence at the house was pretty predictable, which is the only explanation for this occurrence. On a day as unremarkable as any, while I sat reading a book in our bedroom, I heard a car pull into the driveway. The sound was pretty distinctive, considering the area wasn't paved but rather made up of gravel. Thinking that Cody had come home early from work, I slipped on some shoes and started for the front door, which was on the other side of the house. Before I could reach it, a knock sounded against the glass. The front of our trailer had a sunroom, basically a front porch that is encased with windows, making it so that you had to go through two doors before stepping into the living room. Being as paranoid as he was, Richard would usually lock the sunroom door before leaving for work unless he was in a huge hurry. Still thinking that maybe my boyfriend had come home early from work, I opened the front door to let him in. Only it wasn't Cody at the door, but rather a short Hispanic man. He smiled at me through the glass and nodded, almost as if I was exactly who he was expecting to answer. I noticed that he had one of his hands behind his back, the other hanging at his side. I tried not to think too much about it. Behind him in our carport was a small white truck, and I could hear that the engine was still running. "Can I help you?" I tried to make my voice sound strong, but it only came out as shaky.
"I'm with the garbage company. I'm here to pick up your trash cans."
I blinked, knowing immediately that this was a lie. Yes, it was common for the garbage company to pick up the trash cans if the bill hadn't been paid, but I had gone with Cody the week before to pay it. Not to mention the drivers would never knock on the doors, they would just take the cans and leave. I glanced to my left, seeing that our cans were still there, where we always kept them, on the outside of the sunroom, somewhat behind the house. They're right there. If you need them, then take them. This time my voice was more assertive, causing my visitor's smile to turn into a frown. "Can I come in?" he asked. I didn't verbally answer. I just shook my head. My heart dropped as I watched him reach up and grab the door handle to the glass door, pulling on it to open it. The door clicked, obviously locked. The man tried to pull it again, this time harder, causing the metal to creak. I jumped back into the house and slammed the front door, locking it with purpose. It was so quiet in the house that I only noticed two sounds: my heart pounding, and the doorknob to our back door jiggling. There's no way it could have been the guy on the front porch. He wouldn't have had enough time to get to the back door, even if he ran. "I'm calling the fucking police," I yelled through the door, still baffled at the fact that this was all happening in broad daylight. I could hear the truck drive through the carport into our backyard immediately after that. I took a moment to look through the blinds of a window, watching as a separate man jumped off the back porch and into the passenger seat. To this day, I'm convinced these men knew I was home alone and clearly planned an attack. One of them was meant to distract me while the other broke into the back door. I still don't know what the front door guy had behind his back. All I can say is I am forever thankful on how paranoid my father-in-law is. Who knows what would have happened if he hadn't locked the sunroom door. When my grandfather was younger, he became the principal of an elementary school. He was in his late 20s, early 30s at the time, and despite being young, he was a born leader. He was a great principal and everybody loved him. I can attest to that as I attended multiple award ceremonies for him, and the respect and admiration he received was crazy. There was a young boy at the school who was having behavioral issues in class, and my grandfather saw that the kid didn't have a lot of parental support. So he called his father and had a talk with him about spending more time with his son and just a general parenting session. It turned out that all the boy needed was his dad's attention, and after a few weeks, he was a happy model student. Whenever my grandfather would leave school late, he would see the dad playing basketball with his son after he had gotten home from work. It was one of those moments he took pride in, being able to make a difference in people's lives. However, not everything has an easy solution, and my grandfather found himself having to deal with an employee, Stanley the janitor. He was showing up to his work drunk. Stanley was an alcoholic with a mean streak, and my grandfather tried on multiple occasions to deal with this. Finally, one day, Stanley shows up so drunk that my grandfather sent him home, and he called up the superintendent to let him know he was going to fire Stanley the next morning after he sobered up. He then warned them to let him deal with it when Stanley was sober, because he was not a stable person. As it goes in these kinds of stories, the superintendent was furious and decided that he was going to call Stanley himself, fire him, despite my grandfather's warnings. No one called my grandfather to tell him about it either, so he was completely in the dark and thought he could just deal with it in the morning. Stanley was furious and went to the school that evening. He searched the offices, my grandfather's included, and tore things apart until he finally got what he wanted. He was in a blaze of fury, and on his way out, he saw the father and his son playing basketball. He walked towards them and pulled something out of his trousers. It was a gun. He then proceeded to shoot the little boy, killing him instantly. The father was so upset and hysterical, started crying, but somehow managed to get the gun away from Stanley and shoot him himself. My grandfather was called to the elementary school immediately by the police because there were 2 dead bodies. The little boy and Stanley were dead, but what was even worse was the crying from the father and him saying that he couldn't save his son. It was clear that he would never forgive himself for that day. My grandfather was pulled aside by the police, who searched Stanley for evidence. They found a hit list of people that Stanley was going to kill, and all of the addresses of those people that he had retrieved when searching the offices. My grandfather was number 1 on that list. So if it wasn't for that father, it's likely that I wouldn't have never been able to meet my grandfather, and possibly my mother and grandmother would have been killed if Stanley had completed his mission. To this day, I get goosebumps whenever I hear that story, and it's just so chilling. My grandfather never uttered a single word about this, and my mother made me swear to never tell anyone I knew. He carried the weight of that boy's death on him until the day he died. So Stanley, I'm glad we never had to meet.
It's 1986, and I'm 7 years old. It's a Friday, and I know that my dad is going to collect me from school. You see, my nan would collect me from school on Mondays through Thursdays, as my parents worked long hours, and they would pick me up from my nan's house around 6 or 7 p.m. On Fridays, my dad would finish around 2 in the afternoon and collect me in his car. I loved Fridays after school, because me and my dad would drive straight home. I'd change into what my dad called my scruff kit, and then would grab Oscar, our dog, and take him for a walk in the park which was 3 streets away. The park was a long rectangle sort of hidden between streets and behind houses. It had 2 entrances, the one we used and the one we called the back entrance, that led out onto a residential street, and then the front entrance, which had a long driveway leading up onto the chapel. Sometimes cars would drive down there and use it as a safe place to turn around and head back onto the main road as if they had missed a turn. Now the park had a long running path through it with trees on either side. To the left was a nice walkway with a garden with all sorts of flowers and benches to sit on with a few trees to climb. To the right was a decent-sized field with a fenced-off play area. This area was near the driveway. Sometimes when we were in the park, there would be a few other people walking their dogs or playing football, and sometimes it would just be quiet, not another soul around, just me, my dad, and Oscar walking through the park. This particular Friday afternoon was a quiet one. As soon as we entered the park, I checked to see if anyone was in the play area. Then, when I saw it was empty, I jumped at the chance to get a swing before anyone else showed up. I told my dad that I was going to the swings, and before he could even answer me, I was already running up the field. My dad just called after me to be careful, and said that he'd be over by the flowers. I go to the swings, and it must have been for no more than 10 minutes when I heard a car pull up from the driveway, but I don't bother looking behind me. I heard a car door open and thought it was maybe the owner of a store opening up early. It was no big deal, so I just continued swinging. I then heard the squeaky gate of the play area open up, and all of a sudden there's this woman standing behind me and smiling. It was a closed smile. I stopped swinging as fast as I could. There was something about her smile that made me feel uncomfortable. "Hello," she said, but I didn't answer her. I looked around to see where her kids were, and I didn't realize she didn't have any with her, which I thought was odd. I then looked behind her towards her car, and now I'm starting to feel panicked, and I'm not entirely sure why, but her driver's seat door was wide open and her engine was still running. It was a big car with a burnt orange color. It kind of reminded me of the cars in the shows in the 70s. The woman then stepped in front of me, blocking my view of the car, and then spoke. "Are you here alone?" she asked. I answered her this time by saying something like, "I'm walking the dog with my dad," and there over I pointed behind me to the opposite side of the park, where the flowers were, but something made me keep my eye contact with her. I didn't turn to point. I also realized that my dad may not be able to see me because of the trees along the path. I also wanted to keep an eye on the car as best I could, even though she was blocking me. The woman looked up the direction and stretched her neck to exaggerate her action. "I don't see them, sweetheart. Perhaps your daddy forgot about you and went home. If you're lost, I can take you to the police station." I remember everything she said to me and how she pronounced her words, especially how she called me sweetheart. I still cringe to this day if anyone calls you that. She then took a step closer, still smiling at me, but at this point it was an open smile, but it looked forced. At this point, Oscar came over to the gate and barked, and I heard my dad call his name, and he was close. The woman stopped smiling, and I looked up and jumped up and ran out the gate straight to my dad. I heard the woman run out of the gate and towards her car. My dad must have seen how scared I was, as he didn't even need to ask me anything. He just shouted after the woman and then ran after her. I then ran after my dad and caught up with him as he had stopped by the top of the driveway. I looked down to see the car turning left onto the road. I remember he looked on my dad's face. It was a mixture of anger and fear, and I remember his fists were clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. He picked me up and squeezed me tightly, and then carried me all the way home, and my dad called the police, but no one came to take a statement as nothing had happened. Jump to 10 years later, me, my mom and dad and a new brother and a new dog are walking through the same park on a Sunday afternoon. My brother asks if we can go play on the climbing frame, as he can see a friend of his. My mom says that she will go with him. As they are walking off, I say to my dad, "Hey, do you remember that creepy lady?" My dad stopped mid-step and clenched his fist, and he had that mixed look of anger and fear again. Very slowly, he began to say there's something I never told you about that day. When the car was driving off, there was a man in the back seat. He looked at me. He looked at me square in the eyes and smiled. It was a horrid, spiteful smile, and it scared me. I knew right then and there they were trying to take you, and he was letting me know how close they had gotten to doing so. That's why I couldn't get the number plate. I just couldn't take my eyes off of him. We moved from that area a year later, and God only knows what would have happened, or could have happened, if I didn't have any wits about me.
My ex-girlfriend and I had been broken up for a couple of days, and she was getting the rest of her belongings out of my house. I was at the gym and I texted her to see if she was finished. I received a text from her saying that she had. Then I finished up lifting before heading home. I got to my house and all the lights were off except for my porch light. I opened up my front door and was hit by the smell of gas. My first thought was that my furnace line had ruptured or something. I left all the lights off and I went downstairs into the basement to see if I could hear or smell anything near the furnace and gas line. But there was no gas smell in the basement. I went back upstairs and checked the kitchen stovetop. Sure enough, one of the burners had been turned on high and it was not lit. I turned it off and proceeded to open all the downstairs windows to vent out the gas. My first thought was that this couldn't have been done intentionally. If my thermostat had kicked the furnace on, or if I turned the light on, I could have blown myself up. The problem was that the knob can't just turn itself on. It needs to be pressed and turned in order for it to light the burner. Then I remember what she told me once. I thought it was a joke at the time. She said, "If I can't have you, no one will." I am 100% sure that it was her who turned the burner to my stove on high without it being lit. So yeah, this crazy bitch tried to blow me, my house, and my cats up.
First off, for those who don't know, a holler or hollow is another word for a dirt or gravel road. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, my dad was in a nearly fatal car accident which really fucked up his back. He was in the hospital for 2 months and had frequent doctor visits for almost a year after that. Because our family lived 45 minutes out in the country and my dad had to go into town for appointments sometimes 2 to 3 days a week, we moved in with our paternal grandparents. They lived about 10 minutes from town across state lines, so obviously out of our school district. This meant I had to switch schools. This wasn't a big deal because I'd been to the school before when my parents temporarily split up. About a month after we settled in is when my grandpa stopped driving my little sister and I down to the bus stop. Our mom was usually up and down with our little sister who was only a few months old, so she didn't get up to drive us either. Our Nana wouldn't drive in the dark unless it was an emergency, and our dad was disabled, so we had to walk. It was down our hauler, which was an 8-minute drive. One morning, my sister and I are walking to catch our bus. We reach the end of our hauler when a black SUV pulls in like a bat out of hell. The driver slams on the brakes of his SUV and comes to a stop about 15 feet in front of us. It happened so quickly that I didn't understand what was going on yet, so I just stood there for a long moment confused. I didn't want to run home, and this ended up being something innocent. My sister and I have come home before because we heard scary noises coming from the woods, and we got scolded because our parents thought we just didn't want to go to school. So I didn't want to miss the bus unless I had to. I grabbed my sister's hand when I heard the door click open. I could barely see because this guy had his brights on, but I was ready to run. He then walks around to the front of the SUV, and I can barely see that he's wearing all black and wearing a ski mask. He starts to run at us just as I hear our bus is a few stops away. It's far enough away that this guy has time to get us and get away before the bus even stops. So I quickly pick up my sister and run as fast as possible to our house. I look back when I hear our bus stop. I guess the driver thought we were waiting in the vehicle or something. Just as the bus pulls in, this guy